Happy Monday, everybody. It's your girl, Marcy Thomas, BGC Book Club and Brown Girl Collective, here with you for another wonderful book and writer. So come on in the room if you don't mind. Let us know where you're joining us from, and we'll get ready to get started here in just a couple moments. I am currently residing on the outside of hot Atlanta, so if you jump in and let us know where you're joining from, that would be wonderful as well. If this is your first time joining the BGC Book Club, we've been around since April of 2020 when I decided to share my love of all things lit with my audience, specifically books that are written by, for, and about Black women, because we all have a story, and there are so many wonderful writers and authors and poets who are out here telling our stories and just sharing wonderful things about us and letting the world know who we are and how we stand up in the world. So I just really appreciate everyone's enjoyment of this platform and looking forward to doing so much more. So tonight I'm especially excited because we have a guest on who actually has a book of short stories, which is the second time we've done short stories, but these are done in such a way where they're short stories, but they're interlocked in such a way that it tells a larger narrative. So I can't wait to get into it and tell you more about it. Tonight's special guest that we have with us is Omolola Ijeoma Ogunyemi, who was born and raised in Ibadan, Nigeria. She was a finalist for the 2009 Penn Stadzinski Award, published in New Writing from Africa 2009, a publication of Penn Stadzinski, now that's a hard one to say, award finalist stories. Her stories have been published in Plowshares and listed in the Best American Short Stories in 2018. Her poetry has been featured in the Massachusetts Review, the Indiana Review, and Wasafiri. She graduated from Barnard and UPenn with bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in computer science. Omolola is a professor of preventive and social medicine at Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science in South LA, where she teaches and conducts research on using biomedical informatics to reduce health disparities, and she resides in California with her husband. So without any further delay, welcome to the room, Dr. Omolola.
Thank you so much, Marcy, for having me. And just Omolola or Lola is fine.
All right. All right. Well, welcome to the room. Welcome to the room. Now, it's funny. I got your name, but that Stadzinski had me messed up.
Well, about time.
So it's such a pleasure to have you here. And, I really, as I told you, as we were preparing to come into the space, that I really enjoyed reading your book, reading the stories. And let me share a copy of it. I didn't do that, but this is a copy of the book. If you haven't seen it, this is something to be on the lookout for online or in your bookstores. But I really do thank you for coming on and being willing to share some of the book and your process with us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes. So tell me, what was it that made you are a very busy woman. You have, as we were talking about, 3 jobs. What was it specifically that made you decide to write Jollof, Rice, and Other Revolutions?
So the sort of origins of the story started in the back of my head when I was a teenager. My mother had mentioned to me, so this is before I came to the US, I was living in Ibadan, Nigeria, and she'd mentioned to me that she had an aunt, so my great aunt had been married to a woman. And I was just like, wow, what? And she told me a little bit of the history and why and how that was culturally acceptable practice back at that time. And I just kept that in the back of my head. And I was thinking, both my maternal and paternal grandmothers didn't have much of a Western education. They were very smart women. They were brilliant women, but they weren't Western educated. And I just wondered what they would think of, my life, of their descendants' lives. It's so different from theirs. And so that was sort of the nugget, the thing that was in the back of my head. But it took me till I was an adult to start writing it. And once the characters came to me, they basically wouldn't leave me alone. I mean, I just, I would write, and then I would have to do, my regular research or publish,
Mhm.
academic papers on informatics. But that story would still be, I'd wake up at night like, oh, you got to put this down, you got to write this down. And so I knew that I had to finish something. I knew I had to tell these stories because the characters just kept coming and basically insisted on having their stories told. That's the best way I could put it.
Right. And I know as I was doing my research, it took you several years to kind of
15,
piece it all
15
together.
years, 15 years. It took a long
15
time.
years.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. That's something. Some people can't hold on to something for 15 days. So, so that definitely means these are stories that needed to be told.
Definitely. Yeah.
And so, being that it is short stories, so did they all kind of, well, it took 15 years, did they all kind of come to you at once and you did it over time? Or how was that process of developing? And it's a total of 10 short stories in the
Yeah.
book.
So I would say the first four stories came to me around the same time. In
Hmm.
fact, most of the stories, so at least seven of the stories came to me around the same time, but they were in different stages of progression. The
Hmm.
very last story in the book I wrote in 2018. And it's a little bit different from the others. And I was just
Hmm.
looking at the situation around me in the US. And I had written a precursor, but the direction it took, that started in 2018. And so
Hmm.
that story um was written 2018. And then there's two stories, Goody Goody
Hmm.
and excuse me, Guardian Angel of Elmina. I wrote those in 2020. So I initially had 8 stories when I found a literary agent,
Okay.
and she was like, "Oh, I think we could, you know, make this stronger by telling some more stories, by bringing some more of the characters in." And so I added those 2 stories. So Guardian Angel of Elmina and Goody Goody were written in 2020.
Okay. So, for those who haven't had a chance to read the book or are interested in reading the book, just give us a little background of what the stories are about or what the overall arching theme is about for the stories.
Yeah. So I already mentioned, being motivated by or inspired by, my grandmothers, my great aunt, and I also was thinking about the life of a child in Nigeria growing up because that's where I grew up, and I went to boarding school.
Mhm.
And I mean, I had some of the best times in my life in boarding school, strange as it may sound. And so I wanted to tell all that. So I wanted to basically look through history, how women's lives changed in Nigeria, how my generation was definitely different from my mother's or my grandmother's. And then with the last story, take a peek into the future. Like if you took certain things that were going on right now in the world, especially in the US, to its logical conclusion, what might we see
Mhm.
if we don't push back? What what
Right.
what could happen? And so that's where the inspiration for the stories and the characters essentially came from.
Right, because the book starts in 1897, which of course is our look back, and it goes up to 2050, which we're not there yet. So it has a little bit of, I guess, historical fiction
Mhm.
as well as Afrofuturism. So we have someone. We'll put this up for you to see the comment. Love the stories. I wrote a review on Goodreads for it. Thank you,
Oh,
Phyllis.
thank you.
That last story was wonderfully imagined. Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And she and I talked a little bit about it before we came on, so we'll get into it as well. But one of the things that I love about the book, well, it tells the story of women, stories of women,
Mhm.
starting with the like the main character in the first story, and then kind of goes from there. But I want to start with her because I found that very powerful. It's a story of a woman in 1897 and it ties into the story you talked about in your own family of a woman who was married to a woman, but
Mhm.
not in the way that you might think in modern times. So talk a little bit about that and kind of explain that for a little bit about that for those who may not have had a chance to read it yet.
Right. So back in the day, in certain parts of Nigeria, this wasn't practiced all over Nigeria. So this was practiced in certain parts of Igbo culture, Western Igbo culture in the southern part of Nigeria. And essentially, if a woman wasn't able to have a child of her own, so she found out she was infertile, and she had the means. So again, unfortunately, if you essentially had to have a certain level of wealth, she could. So it's culturally acceptable. She could find a wife, usually a younger woman, pay a dowry, just like a man would for a wife, and then that woman could take on a lover and have kids. But all of society would recognize the kids as being the kids of the sort of wealthier woman. The man would have no claim to those kids. They're her kids, they're her line, everything, society would accept, them as a married couple, and those are their kids. And that's how it worked. So it was a way for women to sort of get around some of the strictures of society at that time. And another way that happened was if a man had no sons in a patrilineal, so some African societies are matrilineal, so that wouldn't matter. But in a patrilineal society, if a man had no sons, he could designate one of his daughters essentially to become like a glorified son or something, and then the kids also would take on that line, the name, and so it wouldn't matter that it was a daughter now, not a son. So there were these interesting practices that existed in pre-colonial times that, when outsiders came in, they didn't understand, and they brought their own biases or prejudices, and they're like, oh no, you got to stop all that. And some of those things were there for a reason, and they weren't hurting anybody. So so I wanted to take a look at that and examine that. And so I did that with the first story, sort of imagining, because obviously I didn't know that great aunt. So I had to imagine what that must have been like, what those times must have been like. And that was one of the most challenging things to write, because I have no idea what life was like back then. And most of the people I could ask could go back to the 1920s, but not to the 1890s.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So some of that, I'm sure, if there was an expert from that time, they'd be like, oh, you got this wrong and you got that wrong. But all in all, from the memories of people who were, living in the 20s or 30s, I was able to piece together some of what life must have been like back then, before most people started to adopt Christianity, before Western education took hold the way it does now in Nigeria. And, I thought it was an important story to tell.
Right. And it definitely is. You and I talked about this a little bit, reading that story, and then on the heels of like seeing The Woman King, for example.
Right.
You realize that even though, with colonization, a lot of things came in and it changed, and we did, people were kind of forced to live a different way, a more patriarchal type of society. Things weren't always that way. In some cases, things were equal, were male or female, like in the Woman King. Things were on an equal par, or even par for, leadership and things like that. One of the other things I found very interesting in the story is that it shows that women have the ability to get out there and like build businesses and be entrepreneurs, and get to a point where you would even have the resources to become a chief, to be able to, if you still wanted to have children or a family, that you could do something like that.
Definitely. I mean, I thought that was important to highlight. But I do want to note, though, that you had to have a certain amount of sort of privilege to get to that point. So yes, it was possible for certain women to do that, and to be sort of recognized and revered in society, and to be chiefs, and to be anything they wanted to be. But that kind of went hand in hand with having a certain amount of wealth.
Yeah. And quite honestly, I was going to bring this up later, but that brings up a point that many times when we look at, say, the people who move from Africa, wherever in Africa, and end up coming to the United States, a lot of times that's the same situation. It's not always, every person in Africa can't just pick up and decide they want to
Right,
move to the United States or
right.
London or wherever else they say they want to be. There are generally certain things in place that allow them to be able to do that.
Most definitely. And for Nigeria, it's one of the things that has made it a little bit easier for Nigerians, especially to migrate to the U.S. is a legacy of the colonial era. We all speak English, and so we're educated in English. And so, if you have, a lot of the Nigerians who end up moving to the U.S. are essentially university educated. Not
Mm-hmm.
all, but many are university educated. So it's easier for them to be able to find work or to be able to relate to life here. And I really admire those who are able to migrate from places where English is not the predominant
Right,
language, because
right.
that's a lot that you're navigating. The change in language, as well as the change in culture and all of that. But people still do that and succeed in the US. And I really admire that.
That's true. 'Cause speaking of that, earlier today, I can't think of the name of the book right now, but I received information about a book a lady from Cameroon wrote, and
Hmm.
it's like in
Hmm.
French. So it's like
Right,
they're
right,
looking to send me like the English copy of this book that was
right,
written in French. But those are all the impacts of colonialism that
right.
oftentimes we think of as Black Americans. You look at enslavement, what happened here because of the enslavement, but we don't always necessarily think about the fact that yes, people in Africa weren't enslaved per se, but they still had to deal with colonialism.
Exactly. Yeah.
hmm Well, in the story, of course, that's the beginning of the book, but the main part of the story talks about friends, these
Yeah.
friends that happen to meet in an environment similar to what you said in a boarding school, and how they, came together as friends and went on from there. With that in mind, being that you did attend a boarding school, were there elements of the four young ladies that mimicked people that you knew or experiences that you had in boarding school?
Not necessarily people that I knew, but definitely experiences that I had. And I want to clarify something, because many people hear boarding school and they think, US boarding school, which is, posh and,
Yeah.
for really wealthy people. So the boarding schools in Nigeria were essentially set up by the federal government. And
hmm
the idea was a good one. They were set up as unity schools, bringing girls or boys, or in some cases, some of the boarding schools are mixed gender, but it was a majority are either all girls or all boys, and then some are mixed. And the idea was unity schools to bring people of different ethnic and
mm
cultural backgrounds, as well as people from different social strata. So you'd have, the child, if you could pass the exam to get in, the child of, a street sweeper could go to the same boarding school as the child of, like a multimillionaire.
Okay.
As long as you could pass those exams, you could go in. I mean, obviously, it would be easier for certain people to pass than others
Right.
because of resources, but you had a wide spectrum. And then for everyone who got in, it was subsidized by the federal government.
Mm.
So you paid something, but it was affordable. It was such that no matter your income level, you could afford to pay for your child to go if they were able to get in. And so it really exposed me to people from a wide variety of society in Nigeria. And especially, so I had never gone to school with people from the northern part of Nigeria, which is predominantly Muslim. So I'm from the south, which is more Christian. And, in the southwest has Christians and Muslims, but the north is predominantly Muslim. And it was really eye-opening for me, for example, to meet girls from the north who were raised in a predominantly Muslim environment, and some
hmm
of whom had to fight to go to school because their families didn't necessarily believe in Western education. And so, I mean, they essentially had fought their own battles to be there,
hmm
and that was really kind of interesting to see. But I made a lot of friendships from boarding school that continue till today, because essentially you form a sort of sisterhood.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and then there's hazing that happens. Like, anytime you put young people together, that's bound to happen.
Yeah.
So some of the older kids are like, "Oh, okay, there's not that much adult supervision. I can make you do this, and I can make you do that." And I didn't like that, so that was one of the things that I focused on. But it was a point of bonding for some of the people who were experiencing that, and saying, "Okay, we're not going to do that when we get older," and trying to be better, but. Overall, I really found it to be a time of sort of learning independence. So I wanted to go to boarding school. My mom didn't want me to go to boarding school, but she had gone to boarding school herself. And she used to tell all these stories. I was like, well, you got to go, so why don't you want me to go? And so she relented, and I finally went. And after I went through the first hazing experience, I was like, oh, maybe this is why.
Well, one thing to me, I think it would be, good to a certain extent, because it's like you're getting the university or college experience early. So that way you are going to go to college, you already kind of know how it flows. You've gotten used to, being away from home and, all these other things. So I think it's a good thing.
No, that's a good point. Definitely.
In that, but there are 4 young ladies who come together and they form this bond, which I thought was really great. Because I can think of, like, myself, I still have friends from like 3rd grade. So, I can imagine, these are the people you meet and you form this bond and you continue to be friends over the years. But of course, just like with anyone else, they go through a lot of ups and downs. And, we don't do spoilers in this space. So I'm not going to give you spoilers. But there are things that happen that, of course, even though they probably would have had a bond anyway, it's kind of solidified the bond.
Yeah, it brings them, the experiences bring them closer together.
Yeah, there are certain experiences that bring them even closer together. We have another comment. Thanks for this. I love the book. Thank you,
Elisa. Oh, thank you.
But I really, in looking at that, one of the things that came to mind is, we oftentimes will hear about things that we go through in our households with our parents or with our family that have an impact on us for the remainder of our days. But in this story, these young ladies were friends that became like family, and there were things that happened to them that impacted them for the rest of their days.
Right. So in this case, there are things that happen, and no spoilers, but there are things that happen in the boarding school that sort of bring them together and essentially bond them for life. And, I thought it was important to show. So one of the things, this is not necessarily a spoiler. One of the things that I did deliberately, I don't know if people who've read it have noticed, but none of the girls, so the girls have siblings, but none of them, well, one of them is an only child of her immediate parents, but none of them have a sister who grows up in the same household as them. So essentially, their friendship is more like being sisters, because none of them has like a biological sister that grew up in the same household that would bond with them in that way. And I thought that was important as well.
And that's true, because I can think about kind of the same thing. I did not grow up with a sister in a household with me, so that's why those friends that I've had from like the 3rd grade, they're like my sisters. Exactly. So I can definitely see that. Well, you have had the opportunity to live in, here, as well as being, over in Nigeria. How do you see the difference between, or is there any difference, you believe, in the ways that women bond together, say in Nigeria or in African cultures, versus how they may bond together here in the United States?
That's a really good question. I have really good friends that I made here in the US, as well as good friends that I made in Nigeria. I think because I went to an all-girls boarding school, there was no, I'll just say it this way, there was no competition for male attention. And so that wasn't in the mix. So I think I might have had a different experience if I had gone to a mixed gender boarding school in Nigeria, where there definitely were stories of that kind of competition. And so it was sort of a really innocent time. I mean, this is when I was like 9, 10 to 15, 16. So it was really a very innocent kind of time. When I came to the US, it was basically, college,
Mhm.
navigating the college. It was kind of, it was, so uh, reached out to a wider net of friends, more
Mm.
friends who were older than me. I was in New York. Okay, I'm not necessarily saying people should do this, but I got my fake ID to go to the club. Oh, it was completely different. So I bonded with folks around a
Gotcha.
different set of things. That life was different, and so I have lifelong friendships from those times, and we can look back and laugh at a bouncer looking like, is this really you?
Of course it is.
Yes, it is. And sometimes I got in, sometimes I wasn't so lucky, but different sets of issues. And then later on in graduate school, around essentially being one of the, because I was in a computer science department, part of the bonding was around being, the only women or the only women of color in a
Mhm.
department. There was not that many people that were women of any race
Mhm.
or women of color, period, in my department in graduate school. I hope that changes over time with computer science, because we
I
definitely
hope
need
so.
more perspectives across. Yeah, but yeah, so the friendships is just a little bit. I remember when I started high school here. I remember writing back to my friends in Nigeria. I'm like, oh, these girls are just obsessed with clothes and makeup and whatever,
And boys, right?
because we had to wear uniforms, and so
Right,
there was
right.
one. It's like you're wearing your uniform. I mean, you had a different uniform you wore for, like, after school hours, but it was like either blue check or red check or yellow check. It wasn't that different, and so there wasn't competition around, oh, the makeup or this or that. I saw more of that in high school here. But then in
Mhm.
college, people were more free spirited. People were more willing to do, to be whatever they wanted to be, and nobody was like judging or trying to restrict them. So I
Mm.
like college a lot for that. Yeah.
Right. Well, I guess I was just thinking of, of course, like it's kind of happened all across the board, really. How there used to be a time when we were a lot more communal. And that's what I'm thinking from
Mm,
that perspective,
mm,
that,
mm,
in a
mm.
lot of the spaces, of course, I guess if you're in the bigger cities and things like
Right.
that, whether there or here, it's going to be not as much. But, I tend to think of things maybe being a bit more communal than what they may be here. But then once again, I guess it depends on where you are.
Yeah. A lot of the girls I went to school with were big city kids. So they're
Yeah,
San
so that does
Diego, sorry, Bado. So even though we were in a smaller town, they still brought some of some of those attitudes. But yeah, there was more of a sense of community, though, in the sense that we had to help each other sort of is- survive. And I don't mean that boarding school was terrible. It was just, you're in a small town. You don't have as many distractions as you would in a city, and so you help each other get through it. Essentially, you
Mhm.
entertain each other, you bond, you fight, you make up, all of
Right.
that. Yeah.
Right. Well, one of the other things is that shows up a lot in the story is grief, different types of grief, though.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because there can be the loss of, the loss of someone who's passed away. There could be a loss of a relationship
Hmm.
because of, changes in marital status and things like that with your
Hmm.
parents, or, there could be a loss of, the person that you thought you wanted to be versus the person that you actually want to be.
Right.
So, how important was it for you to kind of talk about loss and grief in a variety of fashions throughout the stories?
I think that was one of the more important things that I wanted to focus on. And again, without getting to spoilers, I think you've actually articulated it very well. So grief and loss is not just about death. It's about, it could be loss of friendship, it could be loss or change in status of relationship, it could be all these things. And how do we handle that? Are we in some kind of denial?
Mm-hmm.
Do we take it to an extreme? Do we sort of handle it calmly but implode later? And so different people have different ways of adjusting with loss and grief and different ways of coping. And I hoped to be able to try to showcase some of that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you definitely do. There's one. This is not a spoiler, but there's an instance where there is a loss, and one of the characters is trying to do the things that they thought this other person would have wanted to do, almost like they're trying to, okay, they're not able to do it, so I'm going to do it for them. And it's like, well, is that really what you want to do, or are you doing that, for someone else because you can't really live someone else's life?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was something. Now I also want to talk about Africans as citizens of the world because there is a lot of that in the story. Just of course, we're in Nigeria, but we're all your characters are kind of all around the world having different experiences. And I was in the Air Force for 7 years. My first duty station was in Spain, but while I was in Spain, I did a lot of European travel. And I noticed that I would see, a lot of Africans in all of these different places. And, a lot of times, I guess, because of me being American and them hearing me speak, they knew I wasn't an African. But, I found that quite interesting just to see in your story that they're all over the place.
So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, I wanted to have that be a feature because it was something I hadn't seen. So there's that Toni Morrison statement of, if there's a book that you want to see that hasn't been written, you write it. Right. And one of the things that I hadn't seen, so I grew up in Nigeria in the 80s, and I grew up in a middle class family run by a single mother in Nigeria in the 80s. That was not a usual thing in the 80s in Nigeria. But back then, the naira, which is the Nigerian currency, was about 1-to-1 with the dollar. And so my mom was a college professor. And so that meant we were middle class and we could afford to travel. And we could afford to travel within Africa, and we could afford to travel to Europe. We never went to America, but we went to the United Kingdom. And I wanted to talk about how traveling within Africa as a child impacted me, because Nigerians, I mean, every country, in most countries, people are patriotic or they have pride in their country. But Nigerians can be very arrogant about Nigeria, even as they migrate. A lot of Nigerians are like, "Oh, we're the best in Africa," blah blah blah. And it was just an eye opener. I think my mom did this on purpose, taking us to different countries. So most of the countries that I mentioned in the book, I have been to, and just from the age of like 6 or 7 on.
Oh, wow.
And so just seeing different countries and how so we used to have, power cuts when I was growing up. I hear they've gotten worse now, but, we'd have periodic power cuts, and I just thought, okay, that's just how, power goes out for an hour or 2 or 3, and then it goes back on. And then we visited Ghana, for example. And we're there for a week, and there's no power cuts. And I'm like, wait a minute, I thought we were the best in the. They don't have power cuts. How come we? So it was visiting Zimbabwe, visiting Botswana, visiting South Africa. Not. There's a little bit in one of the stories that's based on something that actually happened in South Africa, because we couldn't leave the airport, and I just leave it at that. Because it was during apartheid. So some of those experiences, I thought, okay, I'll draw on that. So it's fictionalized, but it's based on places that I actually visited and actually went to. And I got to see the beauty of different African countries and how varied and how different the cultures are. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And I think it's something that has shaped me into the adult that I am, because I still love to travel. And I have a great appreciation for African cultures writ large.
Yeah, that's something. I have yet to go, but I'm looking forward to doing it very soon. I found out last year through African ancestry that my mother's line goes back to Sierra Leone. So I
Oh,
definitely want to go to Sierra Leone, but
right,
I have an interest in that because I mean, there are a lot of misconceptions about Africa to begin with. And then the
Mm-hmm.
fact that people look at like it's Africa, it's way bigger than what, it looks like it
Right,
is on the map, for one
right,
thing.
right.
Another thing, there are 54 countries.
Exactly, exactly.
So, each country, and even within those countries, like you said, there are differences, just like it is here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
A few weeks ago, I drove from Atlanta up to Southern Ohio, and you can see differences, even though it's all
Right,
America. There's differences in each state that you go through, and the
right,
continent of Africa is no different. So I really did appreciate, telling those stories, and through the lens of your characters, some of the experiences that they had in that regard there in Africa, but then also outside of Africa as
right.
well, where you go to other places and, you run into people and how people may react or respond to you in a different country, say in
Right.
colonized countries or whatever the case may be. So I think that it's just good to see that. And because there are some people who never go outside of their cocoon, but there's a whole large, wide world around us. And, even in Africa or here in the States, we're not a monolith.
Exactly.
There's a lot of things that are different, and it's good to learn and see those things.
Absolutely. I thought that was important to show. And, I, at some point I was like, okay, maybe I'm going overboard with this. So I pulled back because I was going to do even more on Brazil because I
Mm,
really enjoyed my time there. And I
mm,
found like a number of in Bahia in the Northeast, I found there's a number of communities where people actually still speak Yoruba, which is the language that
wow.
my father's language, but the accent is different and but it's the same language. I'm like, oh my God, that is amazing. And some
Mm,
of the food, and I wasn't sure that they knew, like, so I talk about akara in one of the stories, which is like a fried bean. It's like black eyed peas. You take the skin off,
mm-hmm.
you grind the beans with like onions and peppers. It's really tasty. It's a tasty
Okay.
snack. It kind of looks somewhat like a donut hole, without
Okay.
yeah, like a little, but it's all bean. It's there's no wheat flour in it, and it's
Mm-hmm.
really tasty. And I found out that in it's eaten in Belize, like around Christmas or New Year's,
Mm-hmm.
and it's eaten in Brazil. And I'm like, wow. I wonder if people know the connection. I wonder if they know that it's also eaten in Nigeria in the western part, and maybe that's where it came from, and was taken to different countries by people who were enslaved. And I just thought that was, but I had to like rein myself in and kind of stop somewhere.
Right, and it's so interesting that you mentioned Brazil because some people may not realize that a whole lot of
Mhm.
people who left Western Africa and made it through are in Brazil, even
Right,
more than what came to the United States.
right, right.
So there's definitely a large, contingent. But what I did not know, talking about going back to elementary school in the fourth grade, they had us do reports on different countries, and I did Brazil back then.
Oh, right.
But in my studies, this was a long time ago,
Right.
there was
Mhm.
nothing in there that would have led me to believe that Black people were in Brazil. So
No.
this was a long time ago. But
Wow.
even though I did it, and I enjoyed studying and learning about Brazil,
Mhm.
for me, I'm thinking it from, Hispanic, culture,
Right, right,
not realizing how many Black people are actually
right,
in
right.
Brazil. So it's definitely on my list of places to go.
Oh, it's an amazing place. Yeah.
Yeah. So now one of the things in the last chapter, and one of the guests kind of said something about the last chapter. It talks a lot about it is the more going ahead
Right.
in the story, because we go from 1897 up to 2050, as I mentioned, and it talks a lot about the political and social climate in America, kind of where we've been in the last few years. And based upon when you said you write it, that made sense. Where we've been in the last few years and kind of where, as you stated, where we could end up if things don't change. Um, that was just real interesting to see and to get your take on that as a person who is not native born here, but has lived here long enough to see and experience
Right.
all of the ups and downs. How important was it for you to include that or tell that story as a person? Not really, you are on the inside, but you came from the outside. How important was it for you to tell that particular part of the story?
It was absolutely crucial for me to tell that story. You know, I've had people say to me, "I've never thought about what a Nigerian thought about what's going on in the U.S. before, but thank you."
Mhm, mhm.
And but you know, I mean, any sentient being who was not of European descent from 2017 on kind of knew we were going through a rough time in the
Right,
US,
right.
and that kind of motivated some of the direction that that last story took, because I was like, here's the danger. So I grew up in a country that went through several military dictatorships, and
Mhm,
there's certain things that you start to see certain patterns, and I
mhm,
had never seen them in the US, and I was starting to see them, and
mm.
I'm like, uh-oh. I'm like, aren't people noticing this is not normal? This is not normal. And I just never thought I would see some of those things in the US. So I was like, okay, I have to write how I feel, because I went through a period where I actually thought about, should I go back to Nigeria? Is this a good time to go back to Nigeria? Is it
Mhm.
going to be safe? And my husband is not Nigerian. He's like,
Okay.
I'm not moving to Nigeria, and if anything goes wrong, we stand and we fight here. And I'm like, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Mhm,
That's what we'll do. And what I can do is put words to paper. I'm not a
mhm,
politician. I'm not. What I can do is put words to paper. So I'm going to write something that expresses how I feel about the danger of the current moment. And so
mhm.
that's what I tried to do with that story.
And yeah, and that is something because I do know, over the years, as Black Americans, people will tell us to go back to Africa right about now. It's like, okay, gladly. And of course we know that there, like you said, there are things, every place in Africa is not, there are things there as well, depending on where you are,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
stuff like that. But yeah, I do know, as I mentioned to you earlier, a close friend of mine has, she's living in Ghana now.
Right,
I
right.
know some other people that are choosing to go. Actually, as once I found out about my Sierra Leonean heritage, I could actually get a passport from Sierra
Right,
Leone and
right,
claim
right.
dual citizenship,
Mhm,
which is
mhm,
something on my agenda. Because you
mhm.
you never know, I might just
Right, right, right.
I'm like, I'm going home. Okay.
But sometimes it's just good to visit, just to know.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
yeah,
right. So I mean, it is a thing, but just understanding, the immigrant experience, because people came here looking at this country as a place of great opportunity. I mean, there still is opportunity here,
sure.
but then there are also a lot of spaces for opposition to that opportunity
Right.
that exists.
So I thought that was part of the paradox of the US that was important to look at. It's been seen as a refuge for so many for so long,
Hmm.
but it's also been kind of like a nightmare horror story for some people for also a long time. And many people coming from the outside have not had to reckon with that.
Hmm.
And 2017 on was, you couldn't ignore it. If you
Right,
wanted to, you couldn't ignore it.
right.
If you were from certain spaces, and it was an eye opener for many people. I know of some Nigerians who really, because one of the things that happens when you grow up in a majority Black country is that race is not important.
Hmm.
And I know people are like, what do you mean? If everybody looks like you, it's not top of mind. So other things come to the fore.
Right.
Different kinds of, challenges or rivalries, or you're fighting different kinds of battles. And so sometimes when immigrants from Africa come here, they're still coming here with that mentality. It takes a while to notice. In fact, there are in some cases where people have to explain to someone like, no, that statement was discriminatory. That person put you in your place, and like, oh, I didn't know, I didn't understand, I didn't notice.
Right.
That can be protective for a while, because sometimes if you don't understand that people are trying to slight you, you just go about your business and you get ahead, and people are like, oh. But there's also a danger there, because if you don't know that people are trying to slight you, if you don't know that they're coming for you, then you open yourself up to all kinds of situations where you can get in trouble pretty fast. And so I wanted to, I've lived in the US longer than I ever lived in Nigeria. So I've been here long enough that I've seen, I can see both sides of it. And I wanted to try to speak to that in some way. Because I think a lot of people lull themselves into a false sense of security. Like, that didn't happen to me. That happened back then. It's in the history, it's in the past. And like, there's something that recur, and you need to understand the history of any place that you're moving to. You need to look at what happened before, so you understand before you just assume, oh, everything is great, and try to, move on into the future.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, at one point the PR was really good. Now, not so much. So, so it definitely makes a difference. One other thing that you talked about in the last chapter, and it indirectly ties into the work that you do. As I mentioned to everyone earlier, that you work with biomedical informatics to reduce health disparities.
Right.
30s. I can't talk. But but in the last chapter, you also talk some things about, healthcare system and things like that. We don't have to get into that. However, just, from your perspective as a person who studies what you study, are there any things that we, as the general public need to know or be made aware of in terms of how we can help ourselves in medical situations?
Yeah. So first, I need to clarify that I am not a medical doctor, so I'm not going to give medical advice.
Right.
So I'm a computer scientist who got interested in biomedical informatics because it's computing applied to, medicine and medical situations, and is another way to use computers and computing and technology to help, move people forward, to advance. And that really appealed to me. I never wanted to be a medical doctor. In fact, I dropped biology in high school in Nigeria because I'm like, ugh. Like when we had to do frog dissection and the smell of formaldehyde, I didn't like that at all.
I don't blame you.
I like the idea of being able to help patients or doctors or nurses using computing, using, data from electronic health records. So part of what I do at Charles Druce, I basically was the founding director of a center for biomedical informatics. And it's just a center that looks at computing and health information technology and how we use that, including telehealth. So this is before the pandemic. Now with the pandemic, everybody's like, oh yeah, but this was back then. How can we use it to make people's lives better and to close the gap? So I'll give an example. One of the first projects I worked on had to do with diabetes, and we have a lot of people with diabetes in South Los Angeles, where my university is located. And so it's a real problem because diabetes has all kinds of complications if you're not treated well, and if you can't get your blood sugar to lower levels. So there's, you've probably heard of people getting foot amputations or, losing their eyesight. And so for this project, we focused on vision, and, there's a complication of diabetes called diabetic retinopathy, and it goes in different stages. But if you catch it early, it's completely treatable. Nothing goes wrong. If you wait too long, you can go blind, you lose your vision, but there's no reason for anybody to lose their vision. And part of what people should be doing, if they can, is to see an optometrist or an ophthalmologist every year to get their eyes checked out. Because again, if they see something, they can do something. But a lot of people don't. There's a number of reasons why. Some people don't have a primary care provider. There's some areas that don't have enough ophthalmologists. So that was one of the situations we were looking at in South LA. And so what we did with the original project was a telehealth. We figured out how to bring these cameras that kind of take a picture of your retina.
Oh, wow.
Community clinics. And so the ophthalmologist reading that didn't have to be a doctor at that community clinic. They had to be
Mhm.
board certified, but they could read it from anywhere in the US. And we were able to get people screened that way so that we're able to close the gap. So before, the in-person eye screening,
Mhm.
there's like 20 something percent for that community versus like 60% nationally. And you can see that as a huge disparity.
Right.
80% of the people with diabetes in the community are not getting their eyes checked. That's a lot of people who can go blind without even knowing that they have a problem. And so
Okay.
those are the kinds of things where we're trying to use technology to close the gap, but we recognize that technology is not the only solution.
Right.
Obviously, it would be helpful to have more physicians practicing in these areas. I mean,
Mhm.
there's just no way around that. But we can, with the resources and the people that we have, we can sort of try to close some of those gaps. So another thing I do is called machine learning. It's a form of artificial intelligence where we just look at patient data and try to figure out, for people who are reluctant to even come in, even to get that picture of their retina taken, can we look at your blood sugar, your hemoglobin A1C? Can we look at other values, and putting that together, learn a picture of the state of your eye health, so we can say, Miss, you're sitting at home, you think you're fine because you think your vision is fine, but you are at risk. You do need to come.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
that's another aspect of what we of the sort of work that I've been doing. So it's things along those lines.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. I appreciate you taking a few moments out of book talk to talk about that because,
No, it's very
for
important as well, especially for
yes,
anyone who has chronic conditions. I mean, to
right.
just get yourself checked regularly.
Right, because anytime there's an issue, whether like last week I was at an event where they were talking about disparities with
Hmm.
children who can read. Every time
Hmm.
there's a
Hmm. Hmm.
situation, there's always many levels and layers
Right,
to what's
right,
really going on. So,
right.
the more information that we have, and and things like what you do help to put that information out there in terms of health for people. So I thought that was good to bring up one of your jobs. In addition to, of course, teaching and
Mm.
writing these wonderful books. Well, I said books, plural, so
Ah, so
out
I need
there
to
in
get I need to
atmosphere.
get started on the next one.
Right, right. But I do have a question, and I'm sure you've been asked this question. Putting the name of the book back up, Jollof Rice. I know why you talk about it. For those who've already read it, they know why you talk about it, why that is in the title. But I have the question because every African nation that makes the rice thinks that they have the best rice.
Right.
So, what is your take? And I know you have to say Nigeria because you are
Okay,
Nigerian.
I'm gonna be very diplomatic. I got in trouble because I gave an Essence interview where I was like, Nigerian rice is the best, and then I was like, Ghanaian rice, and people were like, it was all in good fun. It was
Right,
all in good fun because
right.
the biggest jollof rivalry in West Africa is Nigeria Ghana.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just all back up and be humble here. Jollof rice essentially came from the Wolof people of Senegal and Gambia.
Mm-hmm.
They're the originators.
Mm-hmm.
So all of us have sort of come up with a derivation that tastes good, but they're the originators of this wonderful dish, which has spread across the world. I mean, there's jollof in some form in the New World as well. But
Mm-hmm.
I like Nigerian jollof. I have Ghanaian friends who cook really good jollof better than I do.
Mm-hmm.
But I like the Nigerian jollof, the party jollof that I grew up with, because it had this smoky flavor from little bits that would get burnt at the bottom, and it would the
Mm.
smokiness is delicious. And if you could get a little bit of the burnt part, it was absolutely delicious. But to be completely honest, every West African country, whether it's Sierra Leone, whether it's Liberia, everybody has good jollof. It's just
Okay.
I prefer Nigerian jollof. I'll just leave it at
Right, right. And believe it or not, I've never had any. So I need to find
that.
something in
Oh,
Atlanta where I
you
can
need
get
to try some.
some authentic. But for those who don't know, what exactly
Oh,
is it?
so jollof rice, it's long grain rice that's cooked in a sauce that includes tomatoes, peppers, onions, all kinds of spices, ginger. Some people use curry. That's a modern addition, thyme. And so it has heat and spice. It has flavor, and you essentially steam the rice. So the way you would boil rice in water, you're essentially boiling the rice in a tomato and pepper and onion sauce.
Okay.
And so the individual grains, it shouldn't be too it shouldn't be watery at the end.
Okay.
You should be able to see the individual grains, and it just tastes absolutely delicious. You put salt as well, obviously. And I remember reading about a man, I can't remember what country he's from, and he's like, because tomatoes come from the New World, and so in his society they used all the other ingredients I mentioned, but not tomatoes.
Okay.
So it doesn't look, because modern jollof has this characteristic sort of reddish or orangish color. Their jollof doesn't look like that because they don't use tomatoes.
Gotcha.
So when he's saying, "Oh, this is my jollof," people are like, "Oh, what's that?" But that was their tradition, because they didn't add the tomatoes in. They just used all the other spices and vegetables. But yeah, so it's rice cooked in tomato-y stew.
Right. And it's funny because a lot of cultures do have a different type of rice dish. Like I'm thinking about Spanish rice. Or I mentioned I was stationed in Spain. They did paella, which has other stuff in it, which is more a yellow rice with things. Or you hear of arroz. I was going to say that wrong, but chicken and rice or whatever. Everybody has their own, version. So in Africa, ours, of course, is the best. So no matter where it comes from.
Right.
We know how to use seasonings.
No, but if you've never had jollof, if anybody in your audience has never had jollof, just try some. You will absolutely like it.
I heard that they sell it like frozen in like some of the stores now. Like, oh boy, people are trying to colonize the rice.
I actually there's a jollof. I probably shouldn't even say this. If you go on Amazon and you put jollof seasoning, you can buy a jollof package, like a seasoning mix. Okay. Put it together and put it in your rice. I didn't think it tasted like but for other people, that might give them some approximation of what jollof rice is like.
Okay.
The color was right, but the flavor wasn't as flavorful as it would be if you cooked it from scratch. Basically.
Right. That makes a whole lot of sense. Well, thank you for sharing that, Take. I know people are like, what is jollof? What is
right.
So we're at the end. So is there anything in particular that you want people, when they read the book, I'll show it here again, that they can take away from the story or the stories when they have a chance to read it? Is there any specific thing that you're hoping people can take away from it?
It's really, for me, about friendships. I mean, I know it goes into a whole lot of different things, but at the core is friendships and maintaining your friendships. That's the core thing that I would like to take. People, go through ups and downs in their friendships, and that's fine. That's normal. But maintaining and having a group of friends that have your back almost the way that family would have your back. That's an amazing thing to have in life. And so
And that's definitely what the story does, from, the past, present, future. So, well, with that being said, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. I look frozen on my side. Am I frozen on your side?
Yes, a little bit.
Okay. But yes, I just still want to thank you for joining me this evening. And I am really excited about having had the opportunity to read the story. And I hope that others will go ahead and get an opportunity to do so as well. So I'm just going to put it up because it's on my side. I'm frozen. So I'm going to let you go for a moment and just share.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So hold on for me for a second. Sure. And I'm going to go ahead and announce the next couple of books. I'll just put it up since I'm frozen. Next week, we will have with us, our special guest will be Dr. Rita Woods to talk about her book, The Last Dreamwalker. So that's next week on 10/17. And then in 2 weeks, we will have Anywhere You Run by Wanda M. Morris on 10/24. So I'm so looking forward to seeing you all again. And thank you so much for joining us. And everyone, you have a great evening. Take care. Bye-bye.